Mishnah Shabbos, Perik Yud Beis, Mishnah Aleph. Haboina kama yivna v'yei chayiv. How much does one have to build in order for it to be chayiv, as boina being one of the lamites malachas? Haboina kol shehu, one who builds any amount, because even filling up a hole where the size of a nail or the size of a needle, that's enough to be chayiv for boina. V'amasates, one who chisels a stone into its final shape. V'amak b'patush b'matod, one who strikes a stone with a hammer or a small axe to break it off from a quarry. Hakadeach, or one who makes a hole to finish the construction of something. Kol shehu, in any amount, chayiv, he's going to be chayiv. He's chayiv even for making a small cut in a stone, quarrying a pebble, or making a tiny hole. Zeh haklal, this is the rule. Although one is chayiv for any amount, it must meet the following conditions. If anyone does a malacha on Shabbos and the product of his work will last in the present form, the item is ready to be used as is without any changes or improvements, he's going to be chayiv. Otherwise, the act is not chashuv enough and it's not going to be considered a malacha. Reb Shimon Gamliel Omer, Av hamaka b'kurnas al asadim b'shas malacha chayiv v'neishu k'masaka malacha. Even one who strikes with a hammer on the anvil while he's working is chayiv because he's like one who improves his work. An anvil is a flat, like metal table, and the Rab says Av pish ein maka ala malacha. So when a person is forming a metal keli, he uses a hammer to shape it, and the shape that he's trying to make is on an anvil, which is this flat metal thing. So when they would make the metal plates for the Mishkan, they would bang the thing that they were shaping 3 times. They'd make metal plates for the Mishkan. They would bang 3 times on the thing that they were shaping, and then 1 time on the cornice, on the anvil, to flatten out the hammer, to be masak in the hammer, so that the hammer is going to be the right shape and it's not going to mess anything up. So Reb Shimon, so that would be a tolda makbeh patish, and he's going to be chayiv for the banging of the hammer onto the anvil even after he finishes making the kli. He's going to be chayiv for that also. So that's why it's kimisaka malacha, because he's being misaka on a hammer as opposed to being misaka on the actual thing he's making out of metal. Mishnah Beis, Hacherish Kol Shehu, someone who plants any amount of land is chayiv because it makes the area fit for planting even a single seed. Hamenakesh, one who weeds between plants, improving their growth. Hamakarsem, Hamazared, one who cuts dead branches or excess shoots from a tree, both of which improve the growth of the tree. Too many shoots growing out of a tree can weaken it. Since removing dead branches or excess roots strengthens the tree, these actions are told us of planting. So even if a person does Kol Shehu in any amount, he is going to be chayiv. Hamalaket Eitzim, somebody who gathers wood by cutting branches of a tree, depends on his kavanah. Im lasaken, if he intends to improve the tree, kol shehein, he's chayiv for cutting off any amount of wood. Im lahesek, but if he intends to obtain the wood for burning, for cooking, kedei lavashal beitz akala, he's chayiv only if he cuts enough wood to cook an easily cooked egg, which is a chicken egg, which we mentioned many times before. Hamalaket asavim, somebody who gathers grasses by uprooting them from the ground, also depends on his kavanah. Im lasaken, if he intends to improve the soil, Kol Shehu, he's chayiv for uprooting any amount. Imla behema, but if his intent is to obtain food for an animal, kamleifi hagdi, he's chayiv only if he gathers enough to fill the mouth of a young goat. If his purpose is to obtain grass, the malacha is koitzer. When harvesting grass, one is not chayiv unless he detaches enough to fill the young goat's mouth. A young goat is the smallest animal which we have that would eat grass, so a young goat's mouthful is the smallest amount that's considered chashuv, as we mentioned in Parak Zayin Mishnah Dalet. Mishnah Gimel, discussing the malacha of kaisef. HaKaisef shtei oisios, if someone writes 2 letters, ben b'mina, ben b'smailoi, whether with his right hand or with his left hand. The Mishnah refers to a person who can comfortably write in either hand, meaning he's ambidextrous. A right-handed person is not chayiv if he writes in his left hand. The left-handed person is not going to be chayiv if he writes in his right hand. But although he's not chayiv midaraisa, it's going to be also midarabbanon. Bein mishem echad, bein mishnei shemes. Whether he writes 2 of the same characters, meaning 2 of the same letters, like aleph aleph or beis beis, even though aleph aleph is not a word, but it may have some significance. You don't need to write an entire word in order to be chayiv. Bein mishnei shemes, so 2 separate letters, like aleph beis, even though aleph beis is a word, it doesn't have to be a word. It can be aleph hey, it could be anything, it could be vav zayin, even if it doesn't spell a word. Ben mishnei samamanyas, whether he writes them in 1 or 2 different types of inks. B'chal, whether he writes them in any language, meaning in the script of any language. That's what it means. Ksav shel kol umma v'umma. Chayiv, he's going to be chayiv. Amr Reb Yosi, Zok Reb Yosi, lechayiv shtei oisios el mishum reishim. When they said that one who writes 2 letters is chayiv, they meant that he's chayiv only for marking. Because this is what they would do in the Mishkan. They would write marks on each of the Krashim of the Mishkan in order to know which one is its partner when they had to reassemble them. The Levim would mark each Keresh in the Mishkan so that they would know which board went next to which. In this way, when they would put the Mishkan together again after traveling, they could put the boards back in the right order. Rabbi Yossi learns from this that the essence of the Malacha is not writing, but making marks. When one writes 2 letters on Shabbos, he's chayiv not because they are letters of a language and saying something, but because they are marks that mean something to him. Therefore, one is liable even if he did not write letters, but only marks, such as he lines drawn by a workman to mark point in his work, or like a line on a pair of pants if you want to mark where you have to sew it. The Tanna Kama, however, holds that the Levium wrote letters on the boards for this purpose and not marks. Therefore, we can learn from the Mishkan only that one is chayiv for making letters. Interesting about this Nekuda that he's chayiv only for Mishum Reishim. From Nassan Adler, the Rebbe of the Chassam Sofer, was the phenomenal person. He never wrote anything down because he never forgot anything, but he would make marks. He would make like little dots in his Gemara, in his Svarim, for any time he had a Chiddush. I'm sure it was full of plenty of dots. As the old saying goes, Atachayni l'odam dots. But Al Kaponim, that's Mishum Reishim, because he held if you don't forget it, then you're not allowed to write it down. But Al Kaponim, that's the din in the Mishnah, that Rabbi Yossi says that lechavush the Yossi is elam Mishum Reishim. Amar Rabbi. Rabbi says, Matzinu Shem Katan Mishem Gadol. We find the one is chayiv for writing a short word that's part of a long word. That is, even if one intended to write a long word but stopped after the first 2 letters and they form a short word, he's going to be chayiv. Shem Shimon Shmuel. For example, he wrote only Shin Mem, so that can continue into the name Shimon or into the name Shmuel. Noach Nachar, or he's going to write Noach from Nachar. Noach and Nun Ches. Nachar is Nun Ches Vav Reish. So he's writing just the Nun Ches, he's going to be chayiv for that already. Dan mi Daniel, God Mikadiel. As long as the 2 letters that he did write form a complete name, he's chayiv, even though he intended to write more than 2 letters. Although the first example he wrote Mem, which is the form used in the middle of a word, and not Endemem, which is the form that's used at the end of the word, he's still chayiv for writing a complete word. If a person writes the word Shem, Shin Endemem, it's not the same if he writes Shimon or Shmuel because it's not Endemem. This Tana follows the Shita that if the regular mem is written at the end of the word in the Sefer Torah is kasher. Therefore, l'shitasai, even if a word that ends with the regular mem is considered a complete word. Rabbi Yehuda agrees that if he intended to write only 2 letters in the first place, he's chayav for any 2 letters, as the Tanna Kama said. His point is that where he intended to write more than 2 letters, he's not chayav for just writing 2, unless they form a complete word. Mishnah Dalet. If one writes 2 letters on Shabbos in a single lapse of awareness, for example, he forgets that it's Shabbos and he writes 2 letters before he remembers, he's chayav for kaisev. This follows the general halacha that in order to be chayav, a person must have das and must be aware of what's going on in order to be chayav. Although we already mentioned this in Perek Yud Aleph, it's repeated here in the context of the malacha of writing, as the Mishnah will explain. Based on the next halacha, if a person forgets in two halamas. If he wrote 2 letters with black ink, sam is or piment, is a yellow mineral. Sikra is vermilion, which is a red mineral. Kaimis is gum arabic, a hardened sap of an acacia tree. Kankantoim is ferrous sulfate, it's iron treated with sulfuric acid, or anything else that marks permanently. Reishim is something that makes a permanent mark. Or if he wrote 2 letters on 2 walls that meet at a corner, or on 2 pages of a ledger that face each other, and the letters on the walls or tablets are close enough to be read together at one time, chayiv is chayiv. What are we talking about over here? So he wrote 1 letter on the edge of one wall, and the second letter near it on the edge of the next wall, meaning in a corner. He wrote Aleph on the one corner, and he wrote Beis on the next corner. So then if it's Negim, Zef, they're legible together, and it looks like it's a word, so then chayiv, he's going to be chayiv. HaKaisiv al-Basarei chayiv, one who writes 2 letters with ink, or any other substance that make a permanent mark on the skin, he is chayiv. Although letters written on the skin will eventually disappear, this is not because the ink or the writing surface is deficient, but because the warmth of the body causes them to fade. This case may be compared to that who writes letters with ink on a paper and then erases them. Since the letters themselves are fit to last and they're removed by some external factor, one is going to be chayiv for writing them. Hamasaret al-basarai. This is the halacha regarding somebody who scratches 2 letters into his skin with a sharp instrument, which you're not allowed to do. Rabbi Lezer mechayiv chatos. Rabbi Lezer says he's chayiv chatos because he considers even this to be a normal way of writing. Rabbi Yeshua Paiter, Rabbi Yeshua says that he's pater because Rabbi Yeshua holds that it's not a normal way of writing. Maybe a problem of Kseves Kaka, which is a different issue, which we're going to be discussing in Masechta Makos, not here. Mishnah Hey, Kosa b'mashkin, if one wrote with liquids that make a temporary mark that's black, or b'mei peris, or with fruit juices that make a temporary mark of some other color, ba'avak drachim ba'avak hasefrim, or if one drew letters in the dust of the roads, or the powder of scribes, avak sefrim was the dry residue that forms at the bottom of inkwells. For example, he used his finger to indent letters in the dust or in the powder, or he wrote with something else that doesn't last. Pater because one is not chayav for the malach of kaisev unless the writing is permanent, though it's still asam midrabanan to write like that. La'achar yada, if one wrote with the back of his hand facing the writing surface, he put the pen upside down between his fingers and then turned his hand over and wrote. B'ragle b'pivu b'marpikai, or he used the pen with his foot, his mouth, or his elbow. Kasav acha samach l'ksav, he wrote one letter next to another letter that had already been written. Ksav agabe ksav, if he wrote on top of writing, he traced over 2 letters that had already been written in order to refresh them. Ayin gittin dav chaf, and what we're going to explain over there, Mitzvah Shem. Niskamen lichtav ches akasav shnei zayin. He intended to write the letter ches, but left out the middle of the letter, and he wrote 2 zayins instead. In the ksav ashuris, the letter ches is formed by joining 2 zayins at the top. In this case, he didn't add the top of the ches, leaving just the 2 zayins. Echad be'eretz ve'echad be'kaira, or he wrote 1 letter on the floor and 1 letter on a beam in the ceiling. Kostav shtei koslei abayis, or he wrote 2 letters on 2 walls of a house that are not next to each other, or he wrote them on the same wall that are far apart from each other. Al shnei dafei pinkis, or on 2 columns of a ledger, 2 pages of a notebook that are not next to each other, meaning that if you would put the 2 pages together, it wouldn't make a word, unless the 2 letters cannot be placed near each other, unless the part of the page that separates them is cut off. Ve'ein negim zeh zeh. And the last 3 situations, the echad ba'aretz, echad b'kaira, and the skam l'chtav ches akasav shtei zayin, or echad ba'aretz, echad b'kaira, akasav shtei kostav bayis, or shtei dapei pinkis, if they cannot be read together because of the space between them, parter in all of these cases, he's parter from echatos. In the first group of cases, writing with the back of his hand, or he's holding the pen with his foot or his mouth or his elbow, the person is parter because these are not normal ways of writing. And one who writes 1 letter next to an existing letter is parter because he didn't write 2 letters. Although he finished the malacha, a person is not chayav for doing a malacha unless he performs all of it. Somebody who traces 2 existing letters is parter because he didn't create new letters. And the next case of the Mishnah, one who writes 2 zayin letters instead of a ches is parter because he didn't intend to write 2 letters. And in the last group of cases, 1 letter on the floor, 1 on the ceiling, the letters on separate walls, or the letters on 2 separate pages, the person is parter because he didn't write 2 letters that can be read together. Kosav ois achas nutrikin. If one wrote 1 letter with a mark next to it to indicate that it's an abbreviation for an entire word, for example, he wrote the letter kuf as an abbreviation for carbon, mem for meiser, or taf as truma, as was nahug in the times of the Mishnayos. Rabbi Yeshua ben Meseira chayiv. Rabbi Yeshua ben Meseira holds that he's chayiv because as if he wrote the whole word. Since everyone sees that letter as representing an entire word, writing it is equivalent to writing all the letters of that word. It's interesting because the idea of Rashi Tevis Bechlal is the Torah HaRemez, that the understanding is that whenever we get into this, is that it's just like the Reish is Kailal Kala Guf and controls the whole Guf, so too the Reish of the word is Kailal the whole word and controls the whole word. Meaning if you take away the Kuf from carbon, it says Rabban or Rabban or whatever it is, but the Kuf is making the word. Hagam in Hilchas Diktuk is very much not like that because many times the sherish of the word is not going to be in the first 3 letters, but that's Diktuk that we're not discussing that. The Chachamim say that he's parter since in reality he wrote only 1 letter. Mishnah Vav. If a person writes 2 letters in 2 lapses of awareness, for example, he wrote 1 letter without realizing that the day is Shabbos, then he remembered that it's Shabbos, but then he forgot again. I wrote a 2nd letter next to the first. Or if he wrote 1 letter in the morning and 1 in the afternoon, That is, there was enough time between writing each letter to remember that it's Shabbos. The halacha in such a case is that although he didn't actually remember, he is treated as though he did remember because there was enough time for him to do so. It's like almost like a time on him. He should have remembered it was Shabbos. Gamliel says he's chayiv. According to Gamliel, a person forgot that it was Shabbos. The halama doesn't end until the person becomes aware or had time to become aware that he performed the entire malacha. Therefore, if he remembers after writing just one letter, which is only part of a malacha, his first halama did not end but remains in effect. So he wrote both letters during a single halama, which renders him chayiv. Gamliel learns this from a pasuk. However, the Chachamim rule that he is pater. The Chachamim hold that in order for a halama to end, the person doesn't need to become aware that he had done an entire malacha. Rather, it suffices for him to become aware, or have time to become aware that he did part of a malacha. So in the case above, where he became aware after writing only one letter, the first halama ended, and a new one began before he wrote a second letter. As such, he did a malacha over two halamas, which there is no chiyuv. It's only b'halama achas. Adkan.